Thanks so much for everyone for being here. My name is Michael Fernandez. I am the director, I'm going to take my glasses off so I can read, the director of the Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues, or the Epicenter here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you and thank you for joining us here at the 2024 Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Lecture. It's great to see so many people in the room, and welcome also to those who are joining us online. This is no doubt a testament to our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Channa Prakash. Dr. Prakash is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tuskegee University and renowned expert on genetics and genomics, and you're going to hear more about him and from him in a minute. We'll also be joined this evening by a great panel moderated by Dr. Lisa Ainsworth, who's professor of crop science and plant biology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And joining Dr. Ainsworth and Dr. Prakash on the panel will be Dr. Anastasia Bodnar, who's a science policy advisor for agriculture at the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, and Dr. Kate Tully, who's associate professor of agroecology at the University of Maryland. Since its founding in 1948, the AAAS has championed the power of multidisciplinary collaboration to drive scientific innovation and tackle global challenges. So over the past 175 years, scientists and engineers have achieved groundbreaking advancements that have transformed lives worldwide. While we take pride in those accomplishments, we also acknowledge moments when science has fallen short. So it's this awareness that really fuels our commitment to our mission, which is advancing science, technology, and innovation for the benefit of all. Simply put, we strive to advance science and serve society. And the theme of today's lecture, from wild grains to CRISPR, the journey of agricultural innovation and its role in global food security, could not be more timely. At this critical juncture, science plays such an important role in shaping decisions that are going to influence the future health, prosperity, and peace around the world. So Dr. Prakash will guide us through some of those pressing issues in global agriculture, focusing on food security, climate change, and the need for continued innovation. He's going to highlight some of the critical needs to boost agricultural productivity to meet rising global demands while embracing sustainable practices that protect natural resources. Additionally, he's going to also talk about the importance, spoiler alert, importance of public investment in agricultural research and the integration of advanced technology to overcome all of these challenges. So today's event is really a testament to the enduring partnership that helps us pursue our shared mission. So I really want to take just one more moment to thank Dr. Daniel Robinson, who's the president of the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, for his dedication to promoting a deeper understanding of agriculture. And this lecture also builds on the historic collaboration between AAAS and Charles Valentine Riley, who was a visionary advocate for applying scientific knowledge to enhance agriculture and was the, I think, vice president, I can't remember the title, of the biology section of AAAS in 1880, I can't remember the year now, I should have it written down. And finally, I'd like to express our gratitude to Ambassador Terry Branstad and the president of the World Food Prize Foundation for their commitment to inspiring innovations that sustainably increase the availability and quality of food worldwide. So with that, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Robinson. Thank you.
Good evening. It's so nice to see you here in person and online. I want to thank Michael Fernandez and the AAAS for hosting us and being such a fundamental part of this program every year. And so let's have a round of applause for our colleagues at AAAS. This is the annual AAAS C.V. Riley Memorial Foundation Distinguished Lecture and Panel. We are thrilled to have you here to be inspired and to fill you with renewed energy for the purposes and work of agriculture and natural resources. This is an intention that our namesake of this lecture, C.V. Riley, would no doubt himself support, taking time to renew our energy. I'm Dan Robeson, as introduced, and I have the distinct privilege to serve as the president of the C.V. Riley Memorial Foundation. It's a little bitty foundation. This is our signature activity, and we are very proud of it. We think it's important. We have a terrific board and a support group that includes, as Michael already indicated and is shown on the slide, AAAS, the World Food Prize Foundation. We receive great support from our colleagues at CAST, the Council of Agricultural Science and Technology, and many, many others who participate and help us along the way. I also serve as the Dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Iowa State University. It is fitting that I spend some time to talk a little bit about C.V. Riley himself. He is the namesake of our lecture and our inspiration here. And so let me tell you a little bit about C.V. Riley and the C.V. Riley Memorial Foundation and why we do this each year. AAAS, among other prestigious scientific organizations and agricultural organizations, are committed to this lecture and to the panel which follows. And tomorrow morning we have a policy roundtable on agricultural trade, and you are all certainly invited to that as well, either in person or online. You can go to the same website that you registered for this lecture and find information about that. I'm going to start back in 1872. 1872, C.V. Riley himself said the following, and I'm certain we would all still agree. He said, quote, "None but the well-informed are successful in agriculture, for success in agriculture today implies knowledge, that being scientific knowledge." Who was this person, Charles Valentine Riley? He was born in England in 1843. His family moved to Illinois when he was 17 years old in 1860, and he initially worked in the Chicago area as a farm laborer, found his way into writing and illustration, and soon, through self-education, became an entomologist, a poet, a linguist, and a leader, a self-taught person indeed. In 1864, he enlisted in the Illinois 134th Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War. In 1868, he became the state entomologist for Missouri, the first person to hold such a position. And then from 1876 until 1895, he worked here in Washington, D.C., creating and leading such things as the Office of Experimental Stations at the USDA, the U.S. Entomological Commission, the U.S. Office of Economic Ornithology, the National Insect Collection at the Smithsonian Institution, which he was a curator for many years, and helped to found what is today the Entomological Society of America, a fundamentally important person in the emergence of science and agricultural practices in the U.S., and frankly around the world. He was a pioneer in the use of biocontrol as an integrated pest management tool. He worked in development of sprayer technology, again for pest management issues. He studied the coevolution of insects in terms of mimicry, the famous mimicry of the viceroy butterfly with respect to the monarch butterfly, and was famously involved in solving the problems of phylloxera in grapes, cottony cushion scale in citrus, cottonworm, mountain locusts, and many other challenges to our society. Earlier in his life, in 1878, he married Emily Kozelman. Together they had 7 children and lived here in Washington, D.C. for many years, and tragically, at age 51, was killed here in D.C. in a bicycle accident. Imagine if he had lived another 30 years, the things he would have contributed. Moving 100 years further, in the mid-1980s, a granddaughter of C.V. Riley and Emily Riley endowed and enabled the foundation that now bears his name and brings you this lecture in association with AAAS. We do this through a variety of activities meant to enliven the legacy of C.V. Riley and to accomplish the call to action in our statement of purpose. And let me read that to you. It is relevant as well. The call to action is this: to promote a broader and more complete understanding of agriculture as the most basic human endeavor, to make secure the lever that is agriculture and its fulcrum, the natural environment, during this and succeeding generations, and to facilitate the exchange of disparate views between individuals and groups, and to make those views more apparent to the public at large. That is what we're doing tonight. Tonight, we are also honored to have as our distinguished speaker, Dr. Channa Prakash, who will speak to issues of agricultural innovation and food security, exactly aligned with the legacy of C.V. Riley. Dr. Prakash, would you please come forward while I introduce you? Dr. Prakash is the Dean is Dean and Professor at Tuskegee University. He is an agricultural biotechnologist and geneticist of great accomplishment. His work would make another prestigious Tuskegee scientist very proud, none other than George Washington Carver, not the least of which because they both worked on soybeans and sweet potatoes. Dr. Prakash holds degrees from the Australian National University in Canberra and the University of Agricultural Sciences in Bangalore, India. He received the 2015 Borlaug Cass Communications Award, awarded at the World Food Prize meetings. For example, he is recognized by the Huffington Post as among the top 30 influencers in biopharma and biotech. He has more than 100,000 followers on social media related to his work. Perhaps some of you are or will become a follower on social media of Dr. Prakash. He is the editor-in-chief of the distinguished journal GM Crops and Foods. He has numerous other awards. He travels the world as a lecturer and an inspiring speaker. Please help me welcome Dr. Prakash.
Thank you very much, Dean Robinson, for this wonderful introduction. It's been a real privilege and a honor for me to be selected to speak for the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Lecture, especially considering an incredible agricultural scientist and entomologist Dr. Valentine was. And as Dr. Robinson reminded us, Valentine was not only an entomologist, he was a polymath in many ways, and in many ways reminded me of George Washington Carver, a great Tuskegee scientist that Dr. Robinson reminded us. And I'm really grateful to AAAS, the World Food Prize Foundation, and of course the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation for giving me this opportunity to talk about agriculture and agriculture innovation, which is really the primary focus of the Riley Memorial Foundation. You know, I grew up in India in the 1960s. That's the time, in 2 years, there was a successive drought in India, and there was a crop failure. And India faced a very impending massive famine, and that was only averted by shipments of grain from the United States that really saved India. And during that time, a scientist from the United States came to India, and he brought with him a couple of wheat seeds. And the scientist I'm talking about is really from Mexico, an American scientist, is Dr. Norman Borlaug. And he brought with him the seed of the dwarf wheats that you see over there. On the right side, you see the regular wheat, which which is quite tall, and that's the wheat that has been grown for for much of our humanity as a civilization. And Dr. Borlaug brought with him dwarf seeds, and the primary characteristic of the seeds, they were not only the semi-dwarf, but they were also resistant to diseases. And Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, whom I had the great fortune of knowing both Dr. Swaminathan and Dr. Borlaug. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan was the chief agricultural scientist, like the equivalent to the head of USDA here. And along with Dr. Borlaug, Swaminathan experimented with the introduction of these dwarf seeds into India. And that's the birth of the Green Revolution, because it literally changed the face of agriculture in India by introducing this high-yielding variety of wheat. And later it was followed with the introduction of similar dwarf varieties in wheat also. And as we heard from Dean Robinson, Borlaug is credited with saving billion lives, and that's how the Green Revolution is come to be characterized as. And so, compared to when we look at India, from what it was in 1960s when Borlaug came, and what we look at today, you can see how the production of cereals have increased threefold. And while the population kept growing, the food production kept not only in pace with them, food production took beyond the population. And the most important thing to recognize here was that the land that was used for growing our food has remained the same. In other words, India is able to grow 3, 4, 5 times of food in the same amount of land. And India would not have been the fifth largest economy that we see today if not for the Green Revolution. And so that is the most important point that I wanted you to take from this slide. And in 1947, when we got independence, India produced 50 million tons of food. Today, India produces about 380 million tons of food. And what are the important crops that we grow in India? When you look at the rice, that is the most important crop eaten by food that is eaten by most Indians. We produce almost 140 million tons of rice this year, and 120 million tons of wheat. And not only that, many coarse grains also improved their food production. Well, the primary focus was on Green Revolution or these two crops, and I'll come back to how, moving forward, India needs to be looking at some of the other crops, such as millets, that needs also some of the crops that feed India. One other important point to note is that India, in the last few years, has been exporting almost $50 billion worth of food grains in agricultural products every year. So from what was literally a begging bowl in the 60s has now come to be the second largest agricultural power globally. And that has been possible primarily because of the improved crop varieties that were developed in India. And so this ag revolution, which is not just focused on India, although I've taken that as an example, it has been seen all around the world, and it has been seen in many other crops, including maize, which has a remarkable uptick in the production, but also fruits and vegetables and many other crop plants that we have seen. And when you look at how the production of maize, it's even more dramatic. We can see the production of maize remains constant for much of the time the maize was being grown. Up until 1920s and 1930, when the hybrid maize was introduced, is when the real uptick in the production took off in the maize. And as you can see here, with the introduction of double hybrids, and more recently with more the GMOs and the use of genomics, have continued to keep the maize production very high. And another way to look at the incredible power of harnessing the photosynthesis in producing this maize is this NASA picture that shows the amount of that is essentially a graphical representation of the photosynthesis. And the biggest, highest photosynthesis you see is in the Midwest, the heartland of United States, where much of the maize is grown. The second highest intensity that you see for this photosynthesis is in Punjab area of India and Pakistan. That is again where the Borlaug Green Revolution was centered. And so one other way to look at the impact of Green Revolution had is the amount of land that is required to grow a unit of a particular amount of food. For instance, to look at to produce 250 kilograms of corn before the Green Revolution, and before much of the hybrids came along, you needed, that you see here, about 1347 square meters of the land. But as you can see, once the hybrids were introduced and modern agricultural practices were put in place, you can see it was 400 square meters. So in other words, it's less than 1/3 of the land we use today in 1980 to produce the same amount of maize. And as you can see, with the increase in the science and our knowledge, we are able to produce more and more land per unit area. And this is going to be, as we move forward, this is going to be even more critical, because one of the most important positive impact of Green Revolution has been the amount of the land that was spared by the yield that we were able to produce, the land that we did not have to take it from the wild ecosystem. And so this is another way to look at it. In 1700, this was the amount of arable land that was there on the top that you see there. And again, this is the amount of arable land that we use today. So an important point to take away from here is, as we move forward in feeding our 9 million and 10 billion people, we really do not have the luxury of taking any more arable land away, and we need to come up with ways to improve our productivity within the existing agricultural land. And one more important aspect of Green Revolution was the food price. As the food production increased and food production per capita also kept in pace, the most important thing that happened was the amount of food that was spent, amount of money that was spent on food remained constant or even kept lower. And this is very important because food price and the inflation was an important critical factor in the recent election here in the United States. And every year, like even in India, a Rajiv Gandhi government came down because the onion price is very high. So cost of food is going to be an important factor as we move forward, and it is important that we keep the food prices down, and the only way we can do that is by improving the food production and the food productivity. So how do we do this? The Green Revolution was a transformative era. It led to significant increases in crop yields and entailed using high-yielding crop varieties, but also it entailed the use of irrigation, automation, and entailed many chemical inputs, including fertilizers and pesticides. And the impact of Green Revolution was increased crop yields, but there was a little bit of expansion of arable land, and it is still going on in some places like Indonesia. But the most important factor was we have not had any serious famine and hunger, at least due to agricultural productivity issues in the world in the past 60 years. What we see is mostly due to the political reasons in some parts of the world. Of course, some of the negative ramification of Green Revolution was the intensive use of chemical inputs and the monoculture farming, that concerns about soil degradation, water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And also, the Green Revolution had a significant impact on the socioeconomic structure, clearly some farmers benefiting more than others and leading to economic disparities. And so this is something we keep in mind as we move forward. But what has been the basis of Green Revolution is our ability to come up with improved crop varieties. And as we talk about some of the other tools that to improve our crop varieties, I just wanted to remind our audience that we need to look back into the history of agriculture to see why and how we have been modifying our crop plants and our livestock. When you look at a few handful of crops that feed us today. And when you look at the centers of origin of all of those crops, all of them can be traced to the wild relatives of crops that existed. We had a very good example of that is to look at the corn that came from Mesoamerica. And 7,000 years ago, the corn was like this, the teosinte, the wild ancestor of the corn. And during the thousands of years of domestication, it led to a small but significant changes. But only in the past 50 or 60 years, due to the modern plant breeding, we see a sizable increase in the corn crop. And this essentially typifies how the crop evolution evolved in all other crops, including rice that happened in Asia, or in wheat that happened in the Fertile Crescent region. And so, starting with domestication and the selection of all our crop plants happened very slowly, but not with much any scientific inputs. But the use of science in the past few hundred years have helped us to improve many of the crop plants. Another good graphic example is if you look at some of the paintings of how the watermelon looked like in the classical painting that you see in the European paintings, this is what it would look like. And this is what, of course, the modern watermelon would look like in your supermarket. And just to give a couple of other examples of changes, we have just one species of Brassica oleracea with one single or small minute changes and selection for the leaves led to the development of kale. Selection for terminal buds led to the cabbage, and so on and so forth. And so when you look at the history of our agriculture, it is primarily driven by the history of domestication of our crop plants and livestock. And in the past few thousand years, much of the yield levels have remained the same. And when you're starting with about 100 years ago, with the advent of hybrid corn, and then with the Green Revolution, we started seeing the much explosion in the productivity that we see here. And of course, in the past 30 or 40 years, we have had the starting of the GM crops, and with the genomics, with the marker-assisted selection, and more recently with the gene editing that has come along. And so moving forward, in the last 30 years, the impact of GM crops has been very significant. We have to give a few examples. This is a cotton, BT cotton in Australia. Compared to the regular cotton, which is not sprayed with pesticide, this is what it would look like. And similarly with the BT corn and BT eggplant that is grown in Bangladesh, and BT cowpea that's grown in Africa. And this is another example of a very dramatic example of a genetically modified crop, potatoes grown in Uganda, where is very high late blight incidence in the uplands of Uganda. And if you do not spray fungicide, this is what your potato crop would look like. And as you can see, clearly BT or genetic engineering provides an important tool here. Another important GM crop has been the development of golden rice. It was grown in Philippines until it was stopped with some activism. Is a very high, the only known source of biofortified genetic source of provitamin A in the rice. And considering vitamin A deficiency causes so much havoc, again, a bioengineered crop was an excellent avenue to help deal with that problem. And another example is genetically modified wheat that has been introduced in Argentina. And as you can see, this is for drought tolerance. And this is what a regular wheat would look like, and a genetically modified wheat that is able to cope with the drought. And so the GM crops are grown in about 30 countries today, and primarily most of the crops are in soybeans, maize, cotton, and canola. The United States, followed by Brazil and Argentina are the leading countries, but it's also many African countries have also started picking up GM crop. The only region where you don't see any bioengineered crop is Europe, where because of the regulation, it has been fairly absent in that region. And to sum up, the positive impacts of GM crops as it has led to a tremendous increase in crop productivity, help conserve the biodiversity, and provide a better environment by reducing the amount of pesticides that is used primarily in the BT crops, and also CO2 emissions, and how many of the small farmers in countries like India and South Africa, where small farmers were able to grow these crops. But nevertheless, there has been substantial opposition to the use of GM crops, and that has kept this technology away from many of the farmers in Europe and in large parts of Asia and other parts of Africa where it's still not grown. And another, beyond the public acceptance, beyond that orchestrated opposition that we saw to GM crops, another main reason for the hindrance of the GM crops has simply been the regulation. There are a lot of onerous and burdensome regulation that has been put. For instance, to see if you were to develop the same trait using conventional breeding, this is the kind of paperwork that you need to provide. And if you look at the GM crop, this is the kind of paperwork. And this is from the 90s, and if anything, this has gone worse. And that's why the use of the genomics driven and the CRISPR gene editing has been an important development in plant biotechnology that's welcomed by a lot of scientific community and agriculture community, primarily because it does not entail transfer of any foreign genes into the crop. It's simply it's editing, simply to substitute few nucleotides into the genome. And it's not different from the mutagenesis that we have practiced, that we have been practicing for the past 100 years. And a good way to illustrate the impact of CRISPR is one research that I saw here, while just changing one single nucleotide in the gene for the color. For the tomato, the scientists were able to achieve many different colors that you see here. So gene editing with CRISPR and some other techniques simply involves substitution of a few nucleotides in hundreds of millions of nucleotides that are already in the plant genome, and it entails a very small change without a gross alterations that we see in the conventional breeding or even of a transfer of the foreign genes. And so this is a technique that shows a tremendous promise. To give an example, for developing resistance to diseases, like we see in the tomato here, or the golden rice, like earlier I alluded to, for developing vitamin A, pro-vitamin A rich rice. Is Pamela Reynolds' lab in California were able to show that they could do the same with gene editing without transferring any foreign genes into it. And Indian scientists were able to show similar thing in banana. And increase of lycopene in tomato, for example. And non-browning banana is another application of gene editing. When you consider 50% of the fruits and vegetables today in the developing world gets lost due to spoilage because of the lack of refrigeration, lack of sophisticated storage facilities and marketing that you see here, any technology that helps lengthen the shelf life of fruits and vegetables is going to be a remarkable contribution. And so non-browning banana is technology that could be adapted in almost any climatic fruits and vegetables. Another application of genome editing is how we can come up with ways to develop plants that can use fertilizer more efficiently so that we don't have to apply as much fertilizer. So they improved nutrient efficiency plants. But a more important, and also Indian scientists have developed rice with high-yielding type of rice. And so you are only limited in terms of what you can do with genome editing by your imagination and by the science, of course. And one of the most important potential application of genome editing is really going to be now global climate change. We all know the impact of climate change already having havoc. The greatest impact of climate change is going to be in agriculture in terms of because of the altering precipitation patterns. We already see so much of havoc, too much rain and too little rain, and a consequence of that is going to be a very rampant all across agriculture, including increased pests and diseases, but eventually a lot of crop yield reductions that we can expect. And this is again, the genome editing tools provide some really very good potential for crops, where we can develop crops that are tolerant to drought, and we can then make them more resilient to many of the factors related to global climate change. And this is one example of how scientists were able to develop deep roots, a larger root system just by altering the gene for the root architecture. And similarly, we can develop crop plants with high tolerance to salt. And this is, again, you can see the regular plants and one that are genome edited. And similarly, we can also develop crop plants that can tolerate high temperature. This has been shown in tomato plants that were put in high temperature that were gene edited were able to resist, whereas the regular ones almost died. Flooding tolerance is going to be very important, considering many of our crop plants, especially in Asia, the rice is grown along the big rivers, and flooding is a big problem, and it's going to increase due to climate change. There's even a company that plans to grow rice in seawater, an Israeli company, and if that's going to be successful, we can imagine what a big game changer that is going to be. So, to sum up, the future of genomics and crop breeding is going to be defined by increasing in knowledge, not just in genomics, but also many other related areas such as transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and many, including phenomics and others. And the increased knowledge is helping us not only to develop through genome editing, but also more importantly to help in conventional breeding through the marker-assisted selection. And an important point to remember here is, unlike GMOs, the gene-edited crops have been largely welcomed by most of the countries, and there's not been a great deal of regulation. All the countries that you see here that's shown in green, the gene-edited crops are treated more or less as a conventionally bred crops and not as GMOs, with science-based regulation that is not very onerous or burdensome as we saw in the GMOs. And moving forward, the agriculture is also going to be impacted by the tremendous knowledge and tremendous increase in innovation happening in many other areas, including the robotics, where you can see the apples that are being harvested using robots here. And then we have drones. This is actually a video from India where the farmers are using drones to apply agrochemicals and of course, driverless tractors. When we're talking about driverless cars, we have had driverless tractors in agriculture about 10 years ago. And of course, artificial intelligence is one other area of science that is driving a lot of innovation in agriculture, including biotechnology. But nevertheless, farming is an area that is always going to be under scrutiny. It's always going to be criticized. So as moving forward as agriculture scientists, it is going to be important for us to be mindful of the major problem that is facing agriculture and how we can use science and innovation, including genomic editing, as one of the tools in solving this problem and addressing the global climate change, the environmental degradation, and then the water scarcity. And as agriculture scientists, our challenge is to ensure high agricultural productivity while making sure that many of the environmental problems that we've had are going to be kept to a minimum, and that footprint of farming is kept to ecological footprint is kept to a minimum. And this is one I know when Dr. Norman Borlaug gave lecture, he always ended talking about how we must be on guard against when you are making agricultural policies that needs to be as science-based as possible. And he used to give one example of Trofimo Lysenko, a scientist in Russia who was put in as the head of the agriculture by Stalin just because his Lysenko's views on science was in line with the Marxist philosophy at the time. And because of that, what Lysenko did was simply to ban genetics and put scientists in prison and just made pseudoscience as the policy. And because of that, Russia paid a huge price, and China embraced the same policies. And some people say Lysenko probably caused more death in 20th century than any other human being. And so we see some winds of pseudoscience now and then, and here again in this country. And when we are dealing with science policies, we should always be cognizant of our history. Look at what happened in Sri Lanka, for instance, just a couple of years ago, by embracing ideology and by marginalizing science, that a middle-income country was sent into a tailspin by banning agrochemicals, for instance. And so, concluding, I think that humanity has done very well by embracing science in the past 100 years in many ways. Not only we live longer, but we live better. And so I'm very confident that moving forward, that by continuing to foster scientific innovation, we will deal with many of the problems that are going to be facing agriculture, but we need to be very mindful to make sure that the science policies are going to be based on science, evidence, and not just ideology. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prakash.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to invite our panelists, Lisa as our moderator, and Dr. Bodnar, Dr. Tully, and also you, Dr. Prakash. Okay. We are going to have some moderated Q&A for a bit, and then we will open it up for Q&A from the audience, and also I will be monitoring Q&A online. So there are, when it's time, there are 2 microphones here on either side. So when we're ready for that, please step up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask your questions. So, but take it away.
Thank you very much for a really inspirational lecture, Dr. Prakash. I'd like to start just with a question to everybody on the panel, and that is, what has been the most revolutionary innovation in agriculture that you've witnessed in your lifetime?
My lifetime, I would say transgenic technology has been probably the most revolutionary technique that I have witnessed in my lifetime. That is the genetic modification. Although I would, primarily because in the last 10,000 years of our agriculture, much of our change that we have been making with our crop plants and livestock have been very gradual, and it has been the change from within. And this is the first time this provided an opportunity for scientists to go beyond the species barrier to introduce the source for the genes.
Dr. Bodnar?
Yeah. Thank you. There's a lot that we could talk about in this space, a lot of exciting innovations, but I'd say that how quickly things have been advancing, thinking about how my PI was still doing sequencing the long form way on gels. And now we're at the time where you can just order it out and get it back in days. So there's so many things I could point to, but that's what I feel like mentioning right now, is just like the speed in which we can sequence genomes and make more informed decisions about plant breeding and animal breeding. And that's how we can more quickly advance agriculture.
Dr. Tully?
Yeah, I have a different perspective. I'm an agroecologist, so I think more on sort of the larger landscape scales. And so for me, some of the technologies that I think have been really innovative have to do with our ability to use tools like remote sensing and other sort of spatial tools to help us improve agriculture. So for example, now we're able to, with all of our remote sensing technologies, have a better understanding of whether we're growing cover crops in certain areas and the response of plants to nitrogen fertilizer. We also have tools that farmers can implement on some of their combines and some of their tractors that allow them to do precision sustainable agriculture, so you can get really detailed information about your own field, and that can actually help you use less water, use less pesticides, and use less fertilizer.
And so I guess what are the barriers to widespread adoption of all of those technologies as we're thinking about, the lecture about the Green Revolution and all of the wonders of feeding the billion people, but yet at the incredible environmental costs that we face now. So the techniques you're talking about, have the opportunity to increase sustainability. What are the barriers to people using them?
Yeah, hello. Okay. So I spent a couple years of my life living in kind of bouncing between Kenya and Tanzania, and the overwhelming issue that I felt like the folks that I worked with just had to do with access to resources. And so that had to do with financial resources, access to healthy soils, fertilizers. And so, when you're in a situation where you're, especially in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where the food production actually doesn't meet the food security, levels that we need, so we're not producing enough food in some countries to actually feed everyone. What I saw mainly was just an access of resources. And so, sometimes what I would think about is, we would use hybrid maize seeds. Where I was working, we didn't use GM maize seeds. We were using hybrid maize seeds, but ones that you see really often in the United States. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter the nicest seeds that you had. If you don't have healthy soils and there wasn't enough water and there wasn't enough nutrition in the soil, either from compost or from the manure or even in organic fertilizers, those seeds still weren't going to grow. And so those are some of the barriers. And I was talking about remote sensing, and that's all well and good, but sometimes at the very basics, it's just the access to resources that I saw.
And what about barriers to the use of all of the tremendous genomic power that we have today?
Oh, well, you've set me up to talk a little bit about orphan crops. So we have seen incredible innovation in our commodity crops, and Prakash put up those great graphs that show the incredible increase in yields that we've seen, especially in grains. But there's so much agricultural diversity that we haven't been able to take advantage of, in part because of not enough research funding. So I'm a corn breeder. Corn is great, but I'd really like to see more sorghum on fields. We should have higher oat yields, things like that, not just the United States, but all over the world. If we had higher producing varieties that had their disease resistance and things like that, that might encourage farmers to plant more of those crops, increase diverse rotations, get at some of the issues that you were talking about, and help provide healthier diets.
So I'd just like to sort of take you back to the start of the Green Revolution. And if you had all of the knowledge that you had today, what would you do differently?
So do differently when it comes to the Green Revolution?
Yeah, to the Green Revolution. So if we were at that point in history
Yeah.
where Norman Borlaug had the seeds in his hand and you were about to implement that technology, but with today's knowledge, what changes would you make? What would you do differently?
Well, I would say I would focus on a larger variety of crops than just rice and wheat. That was one thing. When looking back, there was so much emphasis that was put on rice and wheat, and at the expense of many other crops, especially in a place like India, where much of the population and the farmers grow millets, for instance, which was ignored, and then the grain legumes that are primarily a source of protein for a country like India that was ignored. That's one thing I would do it differently. And second, while much of the emphasis was on increasing productivity and in development of high-yielding varieties, some of the other areas of science in agriculture, use of integrated pest management and things, some of the ecological, agroecological practices, today that would probably be included in the mix, not just productivity at any cost.
Yeah, what about you, Dr. Tully?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think thinking about, I always think as an agroecologist that, producing food is one thing that agricultural systems can do, but they can do a lot more than that. If you give them the opportunity, they can fix nitrogen and they can store carbon. And so when I think about what I would have done differently, I think it would be having an ecological approach. One of the big consequences I've seen in my work because of the Green Revolution is just, the eutrophication, a lot of issues that we have with pollution and lots of nitrogen and lots of phosphorus in our waterways. This is by bias because I spend a lot of time thinking about water. But even when I was working in Kenya and Tanzania, the goal I always had in the back of my head was how can we improve yields for people who really need to have higher yields, but not repeat some of the mistakes that we made, which was getting really excited about productivity and putting on loads and loads of fertilizer, and to the more than we needed, and then having that end up in our soils and in our waterways.
So it's a problem that's not solved today, and so what can we do to encourage farmers all over the world not to over-fertilize and to value that resource? I guess that's a question for the panel. Do you want to take it?
Sure. I think it's really a combination of everything, right? Earlier today, we were meeting with some students and talking a little bit about extension and the importance there. So there's a social aspect of, farmers want to do what's right. They want to do well by the land, especially if they own it. So the extension angle of helping to educate people on what works and show them, demonstrate what works, as well as combining that with the technologies that are available today. And then the third part is making sure that it's economically feasible.
I would agree with the economic feasibility. I have found in my work that and in Maryland, I work in Maryland, and I always come back to the Maryland cover crop program because I'm so proud of it. But it's an incentive program, and we pay farmers for practices that we know help the environment and they help the soil. And farmers in Maryland, lead the United States in the adoption of cover crops, it's not a fancy technology, but it's a technology, and it really helps improve lots of different aspects of our ecosystem services provisioning. And the way that we have encouraged that in farmers is by incentivizing it, is by providing the finances that they need in order to implement that practice.
So that's a policy change. Yeah, and so, Dr. Bodnar, I was going to ask you a version of the question I just asked. If you could go back to the early 90s, before GMOs were released, knowing what you know today and the response to it, what would you do differently, either in terms of education to people or communication, or through policy changes? And I'll let you take a drink maybe before you answer.
Don't know where that came from. Yeah, so I love this question because as much as the transgenic revolution has been really exciting, there have been some really cool, excuse me, really cool crops that have been developed with transgenics, but I think that they don't really speak to individual people. I might be excited about BT corn, but if you talk to an average person, like, not only are they not excited about it, but they are actively, like, concerned. So I would have loved to have seen more consumer-oriented traits early on, stuff that people can use that, you know, is useful in your kitchen. You showed a slide with non-browning bananas. I hate brown bananas. Like, I know people use them for banana bread, but they have to be almost green for me to eat them. I would really love to see non-browning bananas, non-browning avocados, things with increased nutrition. If those had been the first GMOs that people had encountered, then we'd probably be in a lot different place, not just the United States, but also in Europe and globally.
So another question for the panel, and this is just thinking of the future. Where do you think we need to focus our scientific efforts to meet the goals for sustainable agriculture and food security in the next, say, 30 to 40 years?
Well, you know, as what they say about the future, it's very difficult to predict. But I would think that there are some really exciting possibilities as to where the science is going. So we would probably continue to focus on to at least maintain the stability of yield for crop. It's going to be important, but make sure we need to empower our crop plants in a way to be resilient against many of the factors that are going to impede the crop production, whether it's abiotic factors such as drought or salinity, or the biotic factors that diseases and pests, and ensuring sustainability in a way that we're not going to be impacting the natural resources is still going to be a challenge for agriculture.
So I think a lot about my work right now is really focused on the eastern shores of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, and basically rising sea levels, and the impact that has on coastal agriculture. And so using that as, you know, sort of my frame of reference, I think a lot about how we're going to need to manage agricultural systems in the future. And that means both how can we design agricultural systems that are adapted to climate change, but also might be able to mitigate climate change. And when I say a management system, I really think of it as a system. It's not, you know, corn hates salt. It's not gonna grow. And so, but sorghum actually is fairly salt tolerant, and it's pretty drought tolerant. And so what I think about is that we might need to change the way that we think about an agricultural system. So it's not just a field of corn, but we're gonna need, with climate change, to think about different kinds of crops. The agriculture is going to look a little different. Maybe you allow for a little bit of a grassy buffer that kind of helps with that storm surge, and it protects the crops that are upland. And these, again, are things that would need to be incentivized, because it's a shift in the way that we think about farming. It's not that, you know, the beautiful rows of corn, right? Everything is a straight line. And it may not look like that because of climate change. And so what I've been trying to focus on, especially recently, is really moving into that solution space of how do we design systems, like a matrix of agricultural patches that allows for that resilience, even in the face of climate change. And in my work, that means sea level rise.
I love that answer. I was also going to talk about systems approaches. So I'll pivot a little bit and talk about like the need for the demand side as well as for like companies that service agriculture. So in order to have a more diverse agricultural system that has patches of different crops growing where it's needed, then we need to have equipment that can be nimble enough to harvest and apply, chemicals or other things as needed in a precise way. So we're seeing all kinds of amazing things like tiny drones that can do this type of work. And then on the demand side, we need the big food companies of the world to buy more sorghum, to use more oats and those types of things. Because if there's a good market for it, then farmers will grow it and figure out a way to do that, but only if they can sell it. So right now, you can sell corn and soy really easily, and that's what people grow. But in order to get a truly diverse farming system, it really does come down to eating it.
Yeah, and markets, yeah.
Okay, so I think we can probably open up questions from the audience if there's questions, or Michael, if there's any online. Oh, and please use, there's 2 microphones. Yeah, please come to the mic for your questions.
Good evening. Thank you so much. My name's Todd Winters from the University of Tennessee at Martin, and I'm also a member of the RMF board. And I want to thank you all for just a wonderful presentation. I know this maybe it's because it's not your expertise, but one thing that wasn't discussed today was animal agriculture. And as an animal scientist, actually I've been teaching animal biotechnology for 30 years, and a lot of the stuff, I'm still teaching the same stuff I did 30 years ago, or talking about the same stuff that I did 30 years ago, because even though the research has been done, there hasn't been a big acceptance, including in policy, to even have transgenic or gene-edited livestock products go on the market. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can take that first. I totally agree. I mean, advances in animal genetics, and including transgenics and animal biotechnology, in a lot of cases actually were further out ahead than crop genetics. But uptake in crops has occurred for the past 30 plus years, where really the only place where we've seen animal biotechnology is in the medical space. So we have a lot of policy work to do. I think in the United States in making animal biotech approval processes make more sense, so that researchers like you can spin off a startup and bring products to market the same way that researchers in crops or microbes can do.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Steve Lindas. I'm one of the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows running around DC and AAAS, thank you. But prior to this, I usually preface that I'm a recovering department chair of physics and astronomy. I'm working in the Department of Energy, and energy is my question. So you showed a great graph of increased yield, decreasing area that's needed. But whenever you talk about inputs are energy, and usually that energy is petrochemical based. And so is there some graph you could show that, or slope, hopefully a negative slope, that shows the amount of barrels of oil that's needed per yield ton for different agricultural crops?
I didn't get the last part of the question.
He's wondering if there's a graph that you could show for how much oil is saved per crop that's produced. Yeah. Or the energy input for the crops that you are producing. So as we're producing more yields, are we still requiring the same amount of energy, or is it less?
Right, yeah, thank you very much. So again, the 2 areas of energy use that have been impacted by the advent of the biotechnology crops has been one with the no-till farming, that we use less, we don't, soybeans are not tilled anymore, and so there's been a substantial reduction in the use of energy for farming. And secondly, for spraying, if you use a BT crop that is insect resistant, and you don't need, you won't be spraying as much, so there is going to be a reduced energy consumption. So, well, I didn't show that much very clearly, but there is very clear documentation, empirical evidence showing that how much energy has been saved, and especially from a carbon dioxide emission point of view, there has been some very good data that shows that biotech crops lead to low carbon dioxide emission on the farms compared to the traditional crops.
I guess I would say, to go back to the slide where it showed like the amount of land needed, advances in both farming practices as well as crop genetics that have allowed more tight planting, the reduction of land use to produce the same amount of crops results in energy savings. So I think that that's like a big part of it. And then one thing I wanted to flag that when we were talking about cover crops earlier is there's been some really interesting work in cover crops for energy production. Cover crust is one where it's a reasonably good cover crop that, in different parts of the country, but it's been modified using gene editing as well as plant breeding to produce more oil that can be used for fuel, as well as for other purposes. So I think there's a lot of really exciting work going on where you're both getting environmental benefits as well as producing like secondary or tertiary crops. So I think that's a place that I know DOE is very interested in as well.
And I was just going to mention that it's perfect segue, is that there's actually a lot of work now, I think, being done to think about how we can, these not necessarily biofuel crops, but waste to energy streams too. So I'm working on a project where we have a lot of chicken poo on the eastern shore of Maryland, right? We have a lot of chickens, and we need to do something with all of that. And actually, you can use anaerobic digestion, which is essentially a giant stomach, and create methane, which then can be put into the energy grid. And using cover crops and other grass species actually stabilizes that process and makes it more energy efficient. So there's even ways we can think about markets in using byproducts of crops or parts of crops to help generate essentially renewable energy as well.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, thanks.
I'm a fan of cover crops. I read Rodale Organic Gardening in the 1960s, and they just repeated cover crop every time. But I wanted to ask about the transgenics you said that are the future. We need full transparency, and there was a Tuesday opinion piece in the Washington Post that said, think small. We have to be careful of bioweapons and stuff like that, so there has to be biointelligence, same way there's nuclear intelligence, except there's a lot more biological material than there is nuclear material. Everything has a signature. I think Bayer and Microsoft just put their stuff online using AI so that you can develop your own test, but the transparency part comes in. The Pottinger and Jha said that COVID was made in a lab, with gene edit, so it's mainstream now. They're saying we got to be careful of the experiments. So could you say something about the transgenic stuff and also about the transparency, like the Bayer, Microsoft AI product that they have online?
Ready? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. Very interesting question with a lot of parts. I think that with every technology, there's risks, right? And that's why we have regulations, we have research oversight. So there's a lot of mechanisms in the United States and all over the world to help identify when there are risks and to mitigate them. I think that one thing that is important to consider is that medical research, where we're looking at, working with pathogens, particularly ones that affect humans and animals, that type of work requires much more intense biosafety and biosecurity considerations. Agricultural research, if my corn grain, that I'm, changing the nutritional quality of spills, then I have to be careful because we don't want, unapproved crops in the food chain, but it's not going to be like a biosecurity risk. So there are like different degrees here when we're talking about biotech research in medical and agricultural spaces. As far as the AI piece, we talked about advances in tech, and none of us actually talked about AI, and I probably should have, but we're in such an exciting space. As a plant breeder, I've talked to folks in companies who are using AI to train, I know this term has come in and out of favor, but to train digital twins for their breeding programs so that like I can put all of the data that I have about like a parent, of my different parent varieties, and then do like virtual crosses so that I can predict like what the outcomes are going to be, and then actually make the crosses, test them, see what they taste like, see what the yield is, what the disease resistance is, feed that back into the model, and then like the potential for AI to accelerate plant breeding even more than we've already seen with genomics and bioinformatics and everything is incredible. So I'm not in the lab anymore, I'm in the policy space, but I'm really excited by the work that researchers are doing here.
Hi.
Hey, Mike.
So I have some questions. There are several questions from online, but I'm going to pull a couple out. So one is, how do you think about, how do you go about trying to explain sort of these complicated technologies to a general audience in a way that helps them, better understand what the potential benefits are and allays fears? And there's sort of a related one. I think it's a two-parter. You can choose which one you want. About whether the citizen science movement is something that would have an impact on sort of countering the pseudoscientific activism that you mentioned, Dr. Prakash. So it's a two-parter, one or the other.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for the question, a good question. I would say, when we are talking about really sophisticated or complicated science issues, when we're talking to the general public, I tend to use metaphors to provide an analogy and to tell a story to help simplify that in many ways. For instance, I remember Nina Fedorov, who was the president of AAAS, one time said, look, when you are trying to explain a genetically modified crop versus conventional breeding, it's kind of like if you're in your backyard and trying to get some barbecue going, you could wait for the lightning to strike to get your fire growing, or you could strike a match. And so trying to develop a particular crop variety using genetic modification is like kind of striking a match. It's directed, it's immediate, and you get what you want right away.
Love that. I'll take the citizen science piece. When we have personal experience of something, it's a lot easier to understand. My daughter's 10. We've been doing DNA extractions at science museums and at home since she was pretty little. And so she has a really good understanding about what DNA is and has touched it. And I've seen, a citizen science movement doing things like working with people in the community to transform E. coli to GLOW, like simple stuff. But when you see things like that happen and you're able to really conceptualize what's going on while you're doing it yourself, that really aids understanding. So it takes a lot of involvement from a lot of scientists and interested community members to work in their own communities to do that type of thing. But when you can, it can be incredibly impactful.
Hi there. My name is Dhruv Patel-Tepper. I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Thanks to you all for taking your time to talk with us today. I was trained as a plant geneticist turned plant biotechnologist. Ag innovation is very near and dear to my heart. But I have a bit of a childish question in that I don't know, we've talked a lot about economic feasibility being a very core driver, but I'm kind of tired of waiting for market forces to say climate change is a sufficient crisis, or seeing how the political landscape can create or dissolve incentives for things like cover crops, and then the farmers can't justify that extra effort that could have some more intangible benefits. So I'm curious just to get your advice, kind of person to person, talking to a scientist, science policymaker, where's our agency in kind of pushing the conversation? What can we do as individual actors in the system to say ag innovation doesn't have to be for corn, rice, and wheat, but ag innovation can be in these scales, or I just welcome any advice.
I have a quick thought. It's not, I mean, it's very hard as an individual, right? But I do think that there are really fun groups popping up that are thinking about this, like, this idea of breeding for things that are not just productivity, and breeding, different kinds of crops that maybe have really deep root systems. And I think that, maybe if we had more groups that were kind of working towards that. There was a whole thing about, I remember watching this documentary about bread, like the bread lab, right? Where you're breeding so that you're not just breeding for wheat yields, but for flavors and for different textures. And so I think that because we all eat, maybe there's a way that we can kind of leverage people's excitement about, I think you were getting at this, about foods or about, different flavors, that might be a place where from sort of a smaller grassroots movement, we can start to see putting more pressure on maybe even funding agencies or government agencies to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just add one more thing, that third-party labels aren't always impactful, but they can be. And so we haven't seen consistency yet. I think in like the carbon space or just sustainability or climate in general. But I am curious to see like where market forces, sure, but like deliberate driven market forces could help bring about some of this change. Like you can't expect people to spend a ton of money to upgrade their farm or change the way that they plant if they're not going to see some tangible benefit. Like we're talking about people's businesses and livelihood, so there has to be market forces. But one way that you can get that is by encouraging companies to pay them more so that they can have a label. There isn't at this time a government label for that type of thing, but there are government sustainability labels. I'm thinking about Energy Star, the BioPreferred program from USDA. So like that does exist, but not for climate or sustainability.
I'll just add to that. I think that there are crises that lead to people adopting technologies that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. So if you think about the papaya ring spot disease in Hawaii, there was no natural resistance. So it had to be a genetic modification to save that industry. And similarly, the Florida, the citrus greening disease right now, that has reduced the orange production in Florida by 90%. There's no natural resistance. So there has to be another solution if we're going to save the whole industry.
So another couple of questions from online. A few questions related to the use of, a lot of grain crops are actually being used for energy production or for feeding livestock and not for feeding, humans directly, and sort of some questions. I don't know exactly what the question would be, but, is there an opportunity to focus our attention more on crops that are feeding people directly as opposed to being used for energy or livestock feeding?
Okay, I'll talk about this stuff all night, so. So I think one thing that is, this might not be quite what this questioner is getting at, but one thing that I think is really exciting about biotechnology, particularly biomanufacturing, is that we can very much have both and. biomanufacturing is use of microbes, whether engineered or wild type, to grow really whatever substances you can. And so the classic, I guess, example of biomanufacturing is beer brewing, right? So you're using microorganisms to produce alcohol, and then you have a whole ton of spent grain afterward that can be used for feeding animals or other purposes. And so that technology is really expanding. I've seen companies that are doing such incredible things, whether it's producing vitamins, whether it's producing high quality proteins or keratin for beauty products, like really anything you can think of. There are folks working on using biomanufacturing, turning crops into high value products, high value ingredients for medical, for food purposes and other things. And then that spent grain can also be used for animal feed. So like there's some both and situations there. Same thing with the fuel.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Abby Boyd. I'm also a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation, but was at USDA previously. And my question's in the same vein as Drew's, but more on the workforce side in pushing these conversations forward. So in your experience as educators in academia, as scientists turned policy people, how do you encourage people to go, STEM-minded students to go to agricultural sciences as opposed to medicine or tech or these other maybe more lucrative types of endeavors? And how do we maybe even get them to go into farming on their own or go into agricultural science or into policy? What's your experience been with that?
That has been a challenge for all of us who are in the area of agriculture, especially in the United States. I don't see this as much of a problem in some of the other countries, but in the US it is. Because, you know, as children, we are all fascinated by things that are growing. But some more as we grow older, that tends to go away. But so it's probably important to how we can keep that fascination. And for us in Tuskegee, for instance, we go to a couple of agricultural high schools to recruit our students. There's one in Chicago, for instance. So I would say trying to bring some amount of education related to food and agriculture earlier would be helpful to keep some of the students who are in STEM to stay focused on farming issues. And also we have not done a very good job of selling some of the job opportunities that are there in agriculture. And I think we need to be doing a better job of what is that. And for a lot of lay people, agriculture simply brings of, you know, working in the dirt. But today, much of agriculture is so sophisticated that many of the jobs that are in agriculture. And so I think we need to do a better job of painting what an ag job would be like so that we would be able to attract some of the smartest students into the field.
Yeah, I mean, ag is high tech, right? We've talked about a ton of different innovations from genetics to drones to precision agriculture. This is a tech field. It might not be communicated extremely well though, so definitely work across the country is needed to get that word out there.
I think that what I've noticed in my classes too is that a lot of my students are really excited by the concept of a food system. And I do think climate change is a really motivating factor for young people. So I do think that the students, when I try to motivate students to, you know, stick with agriculture or agroecology, I think that the food system really resonates with people. Where does your food come from? I think that is like, it's something that, you know, is really tangible. And then again, also this concept of climate change. I think that it's a really motivating factor in helping, you know, attract students who are really, really, you know, concerned about the state of the environment and want to work towards solutions.
Okay, so will everybody please join me in thanking this fantastic panel?